Today, we are really privileged to have Dr. Cho Khong here to discuss the insights organizations can gain by incorporating scenarios into their strategic planning efforts. Dr. Khong is an associate fellow in the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford, where he teaches as a core faculty member on the Oxford Scenarios program. Cho was Shell's chief political analyst and a member of the Shell scenario team for 27 years, during which he led Shell's external environment assessments for country and regional reviews and advised on political trends and political risk. He also led scenario projects with a range of organizations, governments, universities, and business companies from around the world. Today, Cho will speak to us about how scenario planning can help organizations think strategically and respond to change. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Cho Khong.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really pleased to be here today. I've spent, as you've said, I've spent close on 3 decades in the Shell Scenarios team. And there's a lot that I could say in the next 25 to 30 minutes. I'll try to condense what I really want to say. And the second point I would like to make before beginning is that I retired from Shell in September of last year. So I'm speaking today in a personal capacity with my own understanding of what Shell's experience with scenario planning is. Now, I'd like to begin with an analogy. The scenarios team in Shell is like a team of window cleaners, cleaning the windows for our colleagues, and those are the ones making the critical business calls. The idea is that they have a clearer view of the world outside, and if they can see more clearly, they will hopefully make better decisions. Now, building scenarios like cleaning windows is also a high-risk activity because you're taking your colleagues out of their comfort zones. You're confronting them with a view that challenges deep-seated beliefs, and that can be uncomfortable. Now, as a scenario team, you don't tell them what to do. Having said that, by setting the context in which their decisions play out, in effect, you are indirectly shaping those decisions. I'd like to cover 3 themes in my presentation. First, why think about the future. Second, some lessons from doing scenario planning. And 3, what can we say about the interface between scenarios and strategy? How can scenarios help in a real practical way to formulate strategy and to decide what to do? This year, 2022, is the 50th anniversary of the Shell Scenarios team. And Shell is one of the few companies, perhaps the only one, to consistently apply scenario thinking in formulating strategy. And Shell's experience with scenarios has, frankly, been patchy. There have been gains, there have been losses over the years. Nevertheless, on balance, there have been sufficient wins to continue with the practice. The company, Shell, is itself over 100 years old. And Ari de Heers was a former head of strategic planning in Shell. Ari compared long-lived companies to trees. A tree grows towards the light. It adapts its shape to harmonize with the prevailing environment, and it evolves over the longer term. Similarly, a living company learns, adapts, and evolves. And in Ari's view, scenarios are a key enabler of that learning, adaptation, and evolution to survive over the longer term. I was once at a scenario presentation given by the then head of the scenarios team to a very, very senior member of Shell. And my colleague presented 2 scenarios. And this very, very senior member immediately focused on the numbers that underpin the 2 scenarios. And he noted that the numbers were identical. The energy numbers and the profitability numbers were identical for the first 10 years. That's not too surprising because, of course, in a way, what you do could well be baked in for a period of time. Only after 10 years do the 2 scenarios begin to diverge significantly. And he said to my colleague, he said, well, why should I bother with these two scenarios when my projects are costed and they pay out over a 10-year time horizon? And my colleague said to him, very simply, because your projects may pay out over 10 years, but as far as we're concerned, the company needs to carry on beyond 10 years. It's that longer term thinking that we try relentlessly to push our colleagues to think about beyond their individual projects, beyond their own little things that they're concerned about. We're trying to get them to think about that longer term trajectory. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin took an idea from the Greek poet Achilles to draw a distinction between the intelligence of the hedgehog, who knows one big thing, and the intelligence of the fox, who knows many little things. And hedgehogs have one big idea and they act on it. Most people, this is my experience, most people in leadership positions are hedgehogs because they got one big idea, they go for it with tremendous drive. And that can be a good thing, but the danger, and I see this so often, is that they base their one big idea on a worldview that's not only limited, but comes from their experience. In other words, their past. And in rapidly changing times, the assumptions that they make could well be obsolete. Peter Drucker, one of the most widely known and influential thinkers on management, once said, I quote, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it's to act with yesterday's logic," close quote. Foxes, on the other hand, take their information from many different sources. They adjust their views, they see a range of perspectives on each situation. And what we try to do in the Scenarios team is to manipulate the hedgehogs into being more fox-like, or if I might say, more open to other perspectives. First, some definitions. Scenarios may be stories about the future, but they're not about predicting the future. A forecast is one view of the future based on one understanding of today and extrapolating that understanding. Scenarios start with a range of different views on where we are today, and that is very important. The best scenarios are developed collectively by people bringing different perspectives to test against each other. Very often in the scenario building, I find myself confronted by views which I find uncomfortable, but I need to get a grip on them and to understand them and to integrate them with where I'm coming from myself. In that way, we can think of different possible ways in which today moves into the future. Ultimately, of course, scenarios are rooted in the present. They're about drawing out the future implications of the present in order to shape what we might do today. It's about what we choose to do today, with an awareness, of course, of its consequences for tomorrow. I now teach at Oxford, and Oxford has its own unique take on scenarios, and it also underlines that scenarios are not predictions. They're a set of manufactured possible future contexts, which are specific, which are aimed at someone, and which have a practical use. Scenarios are not about blue sky speculative thinking. They're a real practical tool. Now, here I am on the right of the picture, or at least a slightly younger version of myself, sitting over a working lunch in a pub in London with in the center of the picture, my then colleague, Martin Haig, who's responsible for the energy numbers and Shell scenarios. And on the left of the picture is someone even more interesting, Ted Newland, who was head of strategy in Shell in the late 1960s. And the story of Shell scenarios begins with Ted. Ted was in his 90s when the picture was taken in 2015, and he sadly is no longer with us. But earlier in his life, when he was head of strategy in Shell, Ted was hugely concerned over the failure of conventional business forecasting, on which so much business planning depended on. And as he saw it, conventional forecasting always failed whenever radical change happened that blindsided the decision makers. And Ted saw radical change coming. Now, here's the thing. Ted was concerned, in particular, with the complacency of the oil industry at that time in the 1960s. He believed that market power in energy would at some point shift dramatically to the Middle East producing countries. And he presented his ideas to the Committee of Managing Directors in Shell. And they replied, this is very interesting. Now, living in England, I know that when an Englishman tells you this is very interesting, what he really means is that he doesn't believe a word that you've just said. And so, thank you very much. Goodbye. The door is over there. Now, there was already an active argument that the balance of power was shifting to the OPEC oil-producing countries, specifically the Middle Eastern Gulf countries. While on the other side of the equation, demand was ramping up inexorably. Ted Newland did not get his insights through some mysterious alchemy. The debate was live out there. Walter Levy, the dean of US oil economists at the time, was pointing this out in the august pages of Foreign Affairs in 1971, and others were expressing similar concerns. The strange thing was that these arguments were raging, but they did not disturb the complacency of oil company boardrooms. What was happening to energy and supply and demand was just blindingly obvious, but people denied it. If you tried to ring the alarm bell, you got told, don't be alarmists. Now, there's a story around how Ted Newland got to study with Herman Kahn, who developed the ideas of scenarios in military strategic thinking. Ted saw the implications, the relevance for the private sector, set up a scenarios team in Shell. And the initial set of Shell scenarios, which were developed in 1971 to 72, were instrumental in building a strategy in which Shell was able to move faster than the competition when the 1973 Middle East war kicked off an OPEC oil embargo. But the key point to make here is that the problem that Ted Newland confronted was not depicting the world outside. He was not saying anything new. He was using scenarios to get that depiction of the world outside into the heads of decision makers inside the boardroom. Now, just think about the problems that we face today. Think about the problems that we deny we face today. Inevitably, they will force change on us tomorrow. And that's where scenarios come in. Pierre Wack was a Frenchman who Ted appointed as the first head of the Shell scenarios team. And for Wack, it was not the predictive capability of scenarios that mattered. What's important with scenarios is to shape mindsets, the mindsets of decision makers, and to encourage them to act. And that's why in the Shell team, we place a great deal of weight to being as close as possible to the decision makers, the senior decision makers in the company. We talk with them, we interact with them as close as we can. We involve them as much as possible in the scenario building so that they own the results. When I do a focus scenario exercise, I always make sure that the country chair is present in the room, building the scenarios with us. So with the 1973 oil crisis, it was the explanatory value of scenarios, their heuristic ability to enable quick decision-making that was critical. In particular, what was clear from the scenarios was that the conventional view in the boardroom, the conventional view of the future, was just implausible. And it's not that Shell acted preemptively ahead of the war, ahead of the OPEC embargo. It didn't. But once those events happened, the decision makers grasped the implications of what was happening much faster than their competitors. You know, in cartoon films, when someone steps off a cliff edge and seemingly seems to walk on air for a period of time until he or she just looks down, and then you realize, this person realizes the ground is so far below, and then he or she falls. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's that realization, that slightly delayed, or very often quite delayed, reaction to reality, which is what scenarios try to close that particular gap. And so we come to black swans, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. It's a term popularized by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his book of that name. He called it, the subtitle is The Impact of the Highly Improbable. Now, black swans, as I'm sure you know, was something that the first European explorers to Australia discovered, and it just blew their minds because for them in Europe, all swans were white. So here was something that they'd never actually able to grasp what they understood a swan looked like, and changed their thinking completely. Now, black swans, according to Taleb, are events that have a huge impact on your business, but they're so rare that they're never factored into business calculations. The problem, of course, as we saw with our 73 oil crisis, they are not rare. They're out there in plain sight. And a key point that Wack stressed was that the future should not surprise us because surprises almost never emerge without warning. And that's why Wack called them inevitable surprises, elements of the future that have already happened, but whose implications have yet to unfold. These inevitable surprises are the linchpins of scenarios. Pierre's analogy was the Ganges River, which he called a most extraordinary river. As Pierre observed, if you see very heavy monsoon rain at the upper part of the Himalayas basin, you can anticipate with certainty that 2 days later, the Ganges will flood at Rishikesh further downstream. This is not crystal ball gazing. This is merely describing the future implications of something that has happened. Now, think about the events that shape the world we live in, that may have struck us as surprises when they happen. 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis. Think about climate change. Think about the war in Ukraine. They are all inevitable surprises. Their origins lie in events that happened much earlier, but whose implications we either refused or could not bring ourselves to consider. We do a wide range of focus scenario work, about 10 to a dozen focus scenario exercises each year, involving well over 100 of them. This focus work is closely linked to specific strategic business decision-making. This may be our country scenarios work or scenarios work around specific investment decisions. There's no way I can do justice to the range of this work. It took up the bulk of my time, and almost all of this work has been kept strictly internal for a very good reason, because it allows us to be completely frank in assessing any situation. And in doing so, it provides a huge competitive advantage to Shell. I've picked somewhat arbitrarily 3 very different examples to shed a little light on what this focus work entails. Now, our country scenario work looks out 10 to 15 years. Sometimes it's triggered by a country strategy review when Shell seeks to refresh its business activities in a specific country. At other times, there's a key business decision to be made, whether to pursue a new business opportunity or to seek to divest out of a country, whatever it is. And the example I have here is China, a country which we revisited repeatedly in our scenario work and where Shell has for a long time been keen to invest in. We can ask a myriad of questions about China, but for scenarios to be effective, we have to have a clear focal question for our scenarios to address. And as an investor, the key scenario question for us, there are lots of important questions, but the key question for our scenarios was the long-term trajectory of economic growth for China and its implications, of course, for energy transition. As for that long-term trajectory, what we sought to explore with our scenarios were the inevitable surprises that lie ahead, the possible turning points to the growth trajectory that we can map out. And what key signals can we identify to alert us to these possible turning points? Of course, we looked at a range of developments in Chinese society, politics, the economy, the relationship with the US and the wider world, and we took in a range of views. But there was always a clear focus to the scenarios that we were putting out. Some of our focus scenario work is also a consequence of specific political events. I was asked to lead a Brexit scenarios project in early 2016, several months before the actual referendum vote. Now, the question that we sought to address was not, will the UK vote for Brexit? We're not trying to predict what was going to happen. Rather, the critical question was, should the UK choose to leave the European Union, what are the consequences? We mapped out 2 scenarios, and this turned out to be a hugely useful exercise when the UK did decide to vote to leave in June of that year. Strangely enough, the UK government, which called the referendum, had itself done no preparation for a leave vote. It was caught completely unprepared. But for Shell, scenarios were useful to prepare senior management in advance and to test contingency plans should Brexit happen. And in 2020, we did COVID scenarios. If you surf the internet, you'll find lots of scenarios in COVID. And generally, they speculate what will happen next, look out 6 months to a year. Our COVID scenarios looked out 10 years because what we wanted to know was the implications of COVID for energy transition. And we knew that the 2020s, the decade we are in, is the foundational decade when many of the hard choices on energy transition will have to be made. Now, we didn't do focus scenarios on pandemics like COVID before it hit, but once it hit, we were most concerned to think through the implications for us as an energy company, and scenarios were the most useful tool with which to do so. Our COVID scenarios, I should say, were one of the few focus scenario exercises which have been made public in summary form. I've spent a great deal of my time inside this building, the Shell headquarters in central London. How do we integrate scenarios into the strategy process? I've talked about proximity to the decision makers, and that's key. You need to be close to the decision makers to have a very clear view of their strengths. They have strengths, but also they're human beings, their blind spots, their weaknesses. And you need to find a way to play to the former and to address the latter. And in my view, that's why hiring a consultant, an outsider to produce a set of scenarios, or even worse, picking a set of scenarios off the internet never works. But you also, at the same time as being an insider, you also have to be detached. You cannot be emotionally involved and to want a particular outcome. A former head of the Shell Scenarios team, Jed Davis, put it this way, I quote him: "You have to be both within the organization, be fully conscious of its needs, politics, and so on, and yet have this ability to step out and to see something different," close quote. Pierre Wack set out two key tests for scenarios. One, what do the scenarios leave out? In 5 to 10 years' time, managers must not be able to say that the scenarios did not warn them of important events that subsequently happened. Now, let me be clear. It's not that the scenarios predict what will happen. Wack himself said, I quote him, "Only God or a fool would pretend to know what the future will be," close quote. But the scenarios need to map out the key forces shaping the world that we live in today, and these forces will inevitably lead to particular outcomes in the future. Two, do the scenarios lead to action? If scenarios do not push managers to do something other than that indicated by past experience, they're nothing more than interesting speculation. Now, looking back at our track record as a scenarios team, I have to say that I think we were rather good on one, though not perfect, rather good, but our track record on two has been more mixed. So Shell's use of scenarios has not been perfect, but it's been good enough for Shell to retain a scenario planning capability. Scenarios have proved invaluable to help set a clear strategic direction. In doing so, they need to be closely integrated into the strategy process. They can catalyze bold action. And when the stars align in Shell, and they sometimes do, they can really supply that impetus that's needed to act quickly. It doesn't, however, always happen. It's helped if you've got rigorous analysis to underpin your credibility, to underpin the scenarios. That's essential. And I should stress, it's a difficult point to make, but I should stress, the more unconventional the analysis and the sources you look to, the more insightful your conclusions will likely be. Who is the decision maker talking with? What is the decision maker reading? And then ask yourself, who is the decision maker not talking to, and what is he or she not reading? And how do you bring those viewpoints into the room? Scenarios can also play an important role in building a sense of identity by providing alignment and vision. And above all, we've found scenarios have proven to be the best way to manage uncertainty and to challenge orthodoxies. Having said that, we've got to be humble. After 50 years, Shell is still learning. Kees van der Heijden, a former head of the Shell Scenarios team, talked about the strategic conversation that goes on in every organization. There's a formal part, the meetings that take place to devise strategy, and there's an informal part, informal, the casual conversation that about the future that spontaneously emerges. The two parts, formal and informal, intermingle. We take ideas from our informal conversation into our formal discussions, and scenarios play a key part in improving the strategic conversation. Scenarios also suggest opening up new collaborations with people in groups that you might otherwise not think of working with. And it's led over the years, our scenarios, for Shell to reach out and to seek to collaborate with all kinds of organizations, even many of our critics. And it hasn't always worked out, I'll be frank, but it's made Shell a much more open organization and a much better organization than what it otherwise might have been. Developing strategy and testing strategy are the two main conventional ways in which Shell uses scenarios, and both have been fundamental to the focused scenario work that it does. John Gray is one of Britain's most distinguished political philosophers and someone whose contrarian thinking often challenges the prevailing orthodoxy. He can be. He has the most incredible intellect, and he can be very irritating at times, but he's been one of our closest collaborators over many years. Jed Davis put it another way. I quote, "You need to push to within an inch of being fired and to keep the executive in the room," close quote. I'd like to turn lastly to the long-term, the global long-term energy scenarios that Shell is best known for and that are the flagship product of the scenarios team. I joined the Shell team in 1994, and these are a list of the long-term scenarios that I've been closely involved with. I divide them into two groups. Globalization was the leitmotif of the global scenarios of the 1990s and early 2000s. This was the big issue of the day. We asked ourselves, what were the implications for energy supply and demand? Now, crucially, the primary audience for these scenarios was internal. Shell's key decision makers at senior-most level. Shell was fundamentally reshaped by these scenarios towards a much more globalized business. About a year after the scenarios were rolled out internally, Shell had started to act on them. A summary would then be released externally at Shell's public voice in the external public debate on the future of energy. The external rollout was important, but it came after and it was secondary to the main internal rollout. The second group of scenarios from 2008 onwards focused on energy transition. In particular, they sought to underline the message that the primary challenge would be climate change and that energy transition was inevitable. Energy transition was predetermined in every scenario that we could possibly conceive. But there's a problem with deep building scenarios that deal with climate change. Because if you aim to do realistic scenarios, the long-term, what you can realistically achieve, looking at today, the long-term implications look distinctly worrying. On the other hand, if you do normative scenarios, in other words, aiming for an ideal world that you want to see, the difficulty then becomes your short-term credibility in terms of what needs to be done right now. And this problem was compounded because Shell's long-term energy scenarios started to be used in the public debate on energy and climate change as part of Shell's public relations engagements. And that muddied the focus from earlier scenarios whose primary purpose was to challenge internal thinking. Increasingly, the internal and external messaging became equally important, and some would argue the external messaging has, if anything, become even more important than the internal. Their relevance internally was more about setting a desired future direction for Shell rather than being the trigger for the bold, dramatic steps that the company needed to take. And one problem was that when Shell made its bold moves in the 1970s, the OPEC oil embargo was a major exogenous shock that Shell was able to react to very quickly because it'd done the scenarios and so on. However, the problem with climate change is that it's a multifaceted problem. It's a gradually worsening one. We may talk of a crisis, but it's like a cup that threatens to overflow as it fills one drop at a time until, of course, it will overflow. With climate change, there's no major dramatic exogenous shock, at least not yet, to catalyze action. And when the cup eventually overflows, it'll be too late to act. We saw the Paris Agreement of December 2015 on climate change as perhaps equivalent to an exogenous shock that would catalyze action, but it hasn't really turned out to be the case. And scenarios as a key part of your public relations efforts tend to rely on idealistic technocratic solutions with the awkward political and economic details swept under the carpet. There was a gap between the scenarios and plausible reality. Scenarios, of course, always come in sets because there's always more than one possible future. And our Sky scenario of 2018 was, however, a single scenario with no other possibility mapped out, which raised the question, what were the other possibilities that were not being talked about? This is the Greenpeace polar bear that was parked outside of Shell Center in September 2015 and every so often emitted a massive growl. The energy landscape today is much more complex from when scenarios first started to be used by Shell in the 70s. Energy links with food and water systems, social movements increasingly call the oil companies to account, and it may well be, under these circumstances, that scenarios are more useful as a tool with which to engage the public debate, rather than for setting strategy internally. But it does muddy the waters when there's no clear specific client for the scenarios, and when you have multiple clients with priorities that don't exactly match each other. Shell has, on a couple of occasions, seriously considered disbanding its scenarios team. Each time it pulled back from the brink. But the value of scenarios needs to be continually justified. Scenarios justify themselves to the extent that they open minds, to the extent they give a real practical steer to decision making. Scenarios fail when they seem to excuse irrelevant distractions or to be too abstract to be of practical use. As of today, that argument hasn't been settled, and perhaps it never will be settled. That judgmental spotlight will always be there. And on that note, I'll turn back to you, Sarah.
Cho, thank you. On behalf of NIOSH and the Office of Research Integration, I want to thank you for that brilliant presentation and those rich insights into the value of scenarios and how they can be integrated into our strategic conversations and decisions. As I mentioned earlier, this recording, the recording of this presentation will be posted on the CDC YouTube Occupational Safety and Health channel, and it will no doubt be a great addition to Strategic Foresight. Jessica?
Next quarter, we're very excited to host Dr. Rachel McGuire from the Institute for the Future, or IFTF for short, as our featured Foresight Friday speaker. On October 21st, Rachel will provide highlights from IFTF's research into how the changing nature of work is combining with economic policies and technological forces to influence the future of individual and collective health and well-being. So related to some of the discussion we had today, actually. Please watch your email for additional information and the registration link for that upcoming event. And so this concludes our July 2022 Foresight Friday at NIOSH. Thank you once again for your attendance. And Cho, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We hope everyone stays safe, healthy, and well, and has a wonderful day.